As low as reasonably practicable, or ALARP, has historically been one of the more confusing and controversial tests for risk acceptability. To explain ALARP, let's start where we were in the previous video, with the basic trade-off test. So a basic trade-off says that a risk is acceptable if the total benefits exceed the total risks. ALARP is also a type of trade-off. In ALARP, we say, is the amount of risk reduction greater than the cost of that risk reduction? Now, it looks superficially similar, but note the really big change in this diagram is that I've actually changed the unit of measurement of the axis. Previously, we were comparing costs and benefits. What we're doing now is we're actually weighing up the costs and benefits, not of the risk itself, but of the mitigation. And that's the fundamental point of ALARP, is that ALARP is actually an assessment of mitigations, not a direct assessment of risk at all. We use ALARP to assess whether mitigations are reasonably practicable. And then having done that, we then, as a secondary process, say that a risk is acceptable if there are no further practicable mitigations. So the process goes something like this. We start off and we make a list of all of the available mitigations for a risk. We then consider how much benefit we would get from each mitigation. Primarily, how much would each mitigation reduce the risk that we've got? We then consider the disadvantages of each mitigation. Primarily, how much does the mitigation cost? We then choose a practicable mitigation, one where the benefits outweigh the cost, and we put it in place. And we just keep repeating that process until there are no more mitigations that we should put in place, because there's nothing else that is practicable, nothing else where the benefit of the mitigation outweighs the cost of the mitigation. And we say that if we have correctly followed this process, if we've appropriately considered all of the mitigations, and we've put in place all of the mitigations that are practicable, then the risk is acceptable. So the risk is acceptable not on its own right, but because the next most practicable mitigation is not something that we want to do, and because we can justify why we're not doing it. Now, ALARP is something that is entirely within the UK, its ex-dominions, and anyone who has adopted the approach to risk from one of those jurisdictions. And in those places, ALARP's been around long enough that it's become legally synonymous with the idea of acceptable. And this causes a lot of confusion because people, instead of using ALARP to understand acceptability, tend to use acceptability to understand ALARP. So they have in their heads something that is much more like an absolute test, and they use that to try to interpret ALARP, and that's caused a lot of confusion. As a result of that, people have had to introduce new replacement terms for ALARP, which are in fact defined the same way that ALARP has always been. So this is where we get ideas like so far as is reasonably practicable, essentially to mean what ALARP always was intended to mean. The fundamental point is that ALARP bases the acceptability of a risk not on any intrinsic property of the risk, but on our ability to reduce that risk. An acceptable risk is one which can't practicably be reduced further, regardless of the size of the risk itself. Now, you'll notice that ALARP then has no intrinsic way to deal with the necessity or desirability of the risk. And this is why, as well as the underlying test, we sometimes bolt on things like absolute limits. And we say, well, there are some risks that are just so high that even ALARP is not an appropriate test. Or there are some risks that are so minuscule that we don't need to go through the detailed process of considering the risks. But those are really sort of adding on some sort of absolute test on top of the underlying ALARP principle.